Hello, my name is Brett Fairbairn, and this video about the Canadian Agrarian movement and cooperatives is available for your use under a Creative Commons license that allows you to share it freely as long as you attribute its source, the Centre for the Study of Cooperatives at the University of Saskatchewan. Around the world, there are many countries where farmers in particular have formed cooperatives, and that's certainly true of my home country of Canada, where in the first half of the 20th century there was an amazing mobilization of farmers' cooperatives and of farmers' organizations. In many ways, it began with mutual aid of farmers, of settlers in rural areas, helping each other out with the harvest, with constructing a barn, with purchasing supplies together. But what distinguished Canada's agrarian movement in the early 20th century was how big and how ambitious it became. And one part of that story was that it was also very political. In Western Canada, farmers organized in 1901 and formed something called the Territorial Grain Growers Association that was one of the first interest groups for farmers and for agriculture. Its purpose was to lobby the federal government for policies that would assist farmers, and in those days that was especially about the moving and the marketing of grain. So the regulation of rail companies, the rules for elevators and for loading and unloading grain were key concerns that got farmers mobilized. But that wasn't the end of it. Farmers didn't only organize on a regional and provincial basis. As early as 1909, they formed a Canadian Council of Agriculture to have a national voice for farmers across Canada. And provincially, they began running candidates in elections, as well as federally, in order to represent their views in parliaments. So at the federal level, farmers articulated their own platform in 1917 that called for things like free trade and direct taxation, nationalization of railway companies, and other radical policies for the time that were seen as fighting monopolies and benefiting farmers. Based on that platform, a group called the National Progressive Party emerged, and in the early 1920s, the Progressive Party became an influential third force in Canadian federal politics. Similarly, in all the provinces. In Ontario, the United Farmers of Ontario began running candidates, leading eventually to the creation of a farmer Labour government. In Alberta, one of the most dramatic developments occurred when the United Farmers of Alberta decided to sponsor candidates in the 1921 election. And it turned out that the majority of the candidates elected in the provincial legislature were delegates approved by the United Farmers of Alberta. So the UFA actually became the government of Alberta and was both a political party and a farmers association, as well, as a matter of fact, as starting cooperatives. In Manitoba, there was a progressive government. In Saskatchewan, a bit of a different story, as the Liberal Party in the province governed along with the leaders of the farm movement and represented their interests in the legislature. So it was a time of enormous political mobilization and enormous political influence by farmers. But, and this is maybe one of the keys to the story, farmers were not only organizing politically. They wanted policy to be supportive of their needs. They wanted regulations to restrict monopolies and defend agrarian interests, but they also wanted to create farmer-owned companies to represent and serve their interests directly in the marketplace. And that was a development that went furthest and most aggressively in Western Canada. It began in 1906 when a visionary farmer by the name of Ed Partridge had made a famous trip to the Winnipeg Grain Exchange to observe how grain was traded, how commodities were traded by the companies that were registered on the exchange. And based on Partridge's report back to the Grain Growers Association, what farmers decided was that they needed their own grain company that would be owned by farmers, where all the profits would go to farmers. The result of that organization was something called the Grain Growers Grain Company, later known as United Grain Growers, which became an important grain trader with a seat on the exchange. It also published the Grain Growers Guide and put out educational materials that supported the prairie farm movement. One of the keys to this story, though, is that farmers did not stop there. So it was one thing to have a company buying and selling grain in Winnipeg, but it still bothered farmers that they had to deliver their grain locally to elevators that were owned by profit-making companies. So they also wanted farmer-owned elevators. And the Grain Growers Grain Company didn't proceed aggressively enough to build elevators, so farmers formed their own companies in Manitoba, in Alberta, in Saskatchewan. With the help of the provincial governments, legislation was passed to create farmer-owned grain elevator networks, financed in many cases by government loans. Local farmers built elevators, created networks of hundreds of elevators, and cooperative elevator companies in each of the 3 provinces. So now, by the end of the First World War, the early 1920s, farmers were trading grain through a farmer-owned grain company. They were delivering grain to farmer-owned elevators, and that still wasn't enough. Many farmers who analyzed the grain trading system determined that the real issue was getting the grain overseas and capturing for farmers all of the profits that were to be made in shipping grain. And at that time, the biggest market for grain was in Britain. So farmers came up with the idea that they would sell their grain directly to buyers in Britain, to the millers there, and bypass the entire system of the grain exchange and all of the private traders along the chain. They debated that idea. They had some experience with it at the end of the First World War when the government of Canada, for its own reasons, created something called the Canadian Wheat Board that served to pool farmers' grain. And farmers wanted to create that again and make it permanent. The government wouldn't do it for them, so they decided they'd have to create their own wheat pools in order to perform that function. A famous co-op organizer from the United States, a man by the name of Sapiro, a charismatic individual, came up to Canada and began giving speeches in the prairie provinces in 1923, urging farmers to form a 100% cooperative organization. Sapiro was a gifted speaker, and his message to farmers was simple. So here's something that Sapiro said. Just remember this: who is paying the salary of every man in the grain trade today, the grain trade of Canada? Who's paying his travelers and his expenses and his dividends? Who's paying the salary of his office boy and of his clerks? Who's paying for his bookkeeper? Who's paying for his stenographers? Who's paying for all his equipment? Who's paying for all his bonuses? He? No. You are paying every cent of that. But you have no right to choose them. You have no right to say what they will receive. You have no right to fire them when they do not make good. You're paying their expenses, their salaries, their profits and bonuses and commissions and dividends, every penny out of your pocket. And that's an end of a quote from Sapiro. So Sapiro's message is that farmers were already paying the cost of running trading organizations. Why shouldn't they take them into their own hands and own them? The result of Sapiro's speeches and of the organizations that were promoting the idea of pooling was the creation of the wheat pools in 1923 and 24 in the 3 prairie provinces. And no sooner were the provincial pools formed than they formed a national central selling agency that sold all of Western Canada's wheat together through a single desk, marketing directly to overseas. It was an enormous development. The Central Selling Agency was one of the largest enterprises in Canada. It accounted for a very significant percentage of Canada's foreign trade. It was the ancestor of what later became the Canadian Wheat Board as a federal marketing board. And the pools themselves existed for several generations as rural development and marketing and grain handling organizations. So the wheat pool story is an amazing culmination of this line of development. So what does this story of Canadian farmers show? Well, 2 things. One is the enormous power and ambition of what they were setting out to do. They weren't content with running grain companies and elevator companies and provincial governments. They aimed to actually have a decisive voice in the world grain trade. But second, there were waves of organizations, and this is a very interesting thing to think about. Why were farmers not content, having created one co-op, to let that co-op develop? And the answer, I think, very simply, is that each co-op, once they created it, was focused on its own business. The grain growers' grain company had a responsibility to its members to market their grain on the grain exchange. It was not their business to take the enormous risk of creating an elevator network. The elevator co-ops, once they were created, were focused on their task of handling grain, and they didn't see it as their business to take the enormous risk of forming a wheat pool. So in order to take the risks to achieve wider and wider ambitions, farmers had to create more and more organizations in successive waves, one after the other. We could also ask, why farmers? Why not some other group in society that would have this enormous mobilization? And I think, again, there are a couple of answers. Farmers, especially in Western Canada, represented a very large part of the population at the time. They saw themselves as a majority, as the common people, as having strength in numbers. And with the progress of industrialization, numbers of farmers later dwindled so that farmers became a small percentage of the total population. But at the time they were powerful, and their interests were pretty close to being the interests of society in Western Canada, at least. And I think the other thing to think about is that there are some unique characteristics to the business of farming, where many small producers on small plots of land deal with a small number of often monopolistic handling and trading companies. And that situation of many small producers dealing with concentrated monopolistic enterprises is a classic case for the introduction and development of cooperatives.